So we'll hope maybe I could try that again. Tonight we'll talk about agroforestry for soil and erosion control. And because Oz is our not-for-profit, we really focus on the value of trees in our landscape. Our presentation is going to focus on that role of trees, specifically to control erosion and overland flooding as well. So firstly, we'd like to acknowledge that Oz, our operations are on Treaty 6, Treaty 7, and Treaty 8 territory, the traditional lands of the Indigenous peoples of Canada and the home of Métis. This workshop is supported by County of Grande Prairie, as well as development through the CAP Agricultural Partnership. So who is Oz? Who are we? Well, Oz is a not-for-profit organization, and we encourage sustainable forest management through conservation and restoration. So our mission simply shares with others the value of trees. So we work with rural communities, municipalities, landowners, and we share with them how trees can be an effective tool in our landscape, providing many different ecosystem functions. We facilitate workshops, field days, lots of learning opportunities. Our organization holds a great deal of experience in completing those field projects as well. So we're often the group that comes out in the field, boots on the ground, teaching people about ecosystem restoration through trees. So that looks like restoration projects, permaculture projects, agricultural shelter belts, and any reason why you'd want trees on your landscape, basically. So our team, a little bit about us. I'm Megan, I'm the executive director. Kate did a wonderful job giving bios. Bob Underschultz, he'll be presenting in the second half of our presentation. He's our senior environmental technician, and he has just a great wealth of knowledge in a lot of the technical reasons why trees are so great. Brianna Wallace, our environmental coordinator, and she kind of helps coordinate all of the stuff that we do, especially a lot of our digital media content and digital information tools. All right, so tonight we'll look at erosion and how erosion affects our landscape. So erosion, there's a lot of contributing factors to erosion. These can be simple factors, environmental factors like sustained wind speeds. Bare and vulnerable soils are particularly prone to erosion. So these can be areas that are overgrazed pastures, areas where there's sparse crop residue on the surface. Excuse me. So these areas often have lack of that soil building root systems, coming from a lack of woody species. And in addition to not having that covered soil, they're also lacking the woody species and the structure to slow down overland flows of water. Oftentimes you'll see these in intense areas where there's intense tillage, so conventional tillage practices. And then all of this kind of contributes to erosion. Let's see, in simulated rainfall studies have found that reduced tillage and no tillage practices reduce soil loss by 50 to 80% compared to that conventional tillage. So the statistics and the research are there. We really just want to take a look at our soil and make sure that we're protecting it and protecting it the right ways. So the cost of soil erosion, and there's lots of studies out there. We've kind of picked a fairly simple one from the Alberta government, and it really shows which areas are affected by wind and erosion in our province. So these areas, there's significant threats to agriculture and the landscape due to erosion. This previous research has estimated that the average cost of soil erosion in Western Canada can be as much as $430 million a year. So that's a statistic taken from 2011, but it holds true. And really looking at this map, it's fairly easy to see a correlation between agricultural land use and anthropogenic land use, and areas where there's particularly high risk of erosion. And looking closer, areas where it's a bit drier tend to have increased levels of erosion. So you're seeing that a lot in the southern grassland areas, as well as in other areas where you don't typically find a lot of those trees. All right, so erosion-related reasons for planting shelter belts, eco buffers, and riparian buffers. So, I mean, there's so many reasons for planting trees. They really, and I mean, Oz are the people to tell you this, but they're really great features on our landscape. Specifically for erosion, we're going to look at how they conserve topsoil, how they reduce risks of that topsoil blowing or washing away. They help distribute snow across the field. They reduce your flood risks, both surface flood for overland erosion, as well as runoff during those floods. And they help stabilize slopes, which are particularly prone to erosion. So when we're looking at trees and agroforestry species, we want to look at the function of those forested areas and how that function really plays into reducing erosive conditions on the environment. So if we're looking specifically at shelter belts and eco buffers, we want to look to the structure of the trees and how they're moving, for example, moving that wind up and over the surface of the ground to reduce erosion, so that ramp effect, for example. We can look at the placement of these forested areas and look at how they're reducing overland flow speeds. So for example, in riparian buffers, and they're reducing how fast that soil is flowing into ephemeral drains, for example. We're also looking at how much and how dense those forested areas are. So how much power those trees have in reducing the effects, erosive effects on the landscape. All right, so before we get too deep into the into our erosion presentation, we can do a brief overview of shelter belts and eco buffers. This photo in the background here, we like to share this one. Almost all of our presentations have it. It's a great example of all sorts of different features trees can add to your agricultural landscape. We've got alley cropping in the top left corner there. We've got shelter belts around different structures. Just off the screen, we have a keyhole barn providing shelter for livestock. We've got a riparian buffer in that bottom corner and lots of great pollinator forested areas around your farmyard garden. So there's lots of great reasons in here for shelter belts and eco buffers. Let's look at maybe a brief definition so that we know what we're talking about. Shelter belts, I think most people have that definition in their head. They're a single or multi-row of trees. They can be one tree species, multi-tree species, and they're that traditional linear forested buffer on our landscape. So many of them were planted back decades ago by the PFRA. We often see that example on the left there. You've got your white spruce or hybrid poplar, and then a carigana or a willow on the far left. So it's creating that ramp shape. It's really providing that function. However, we have, given the length of time since implementation of shelter belts in Alberta, we've had some significant upgrades that we'll talk about here through eco buffers. So eco buffers, they provide that same physical buffering due to the presence of trees. However, eco buffers are a bit different in that they use dense planting of native species. So these trees are your native, just the same as the forests you'll find in your area. They're intentionally planted nice and close together so that all the trees are providing increased habitat for each other. They provide an abundance of ecosystem services, especially great habitat for wildlife that might be in the area. They're irregular by design, and while they can be a little bit of a higher upfront cost due to the higher density of the planting, they're really a great investment in the long term because these trees, they propagate themselves fairly readily, and they also don't require a lot of long-term maintenance. So when you're looking at your traditional shelter belts, you're seeing some of the short lifespans of Okanese poplar, for example, and you're looking towards renovation or restoration of your shelter belt. With eco buffers, they kind of take care of that on their own. So they're really in that forest succession process, like the natural forests in your area. Let's see, our last but not least forested structure we'll talk about today, and especially for our erosion presentation, are riparian buffers. So riparian buffers can be, ornamental species or different species that you select. It's always best if these structures are your native species, so a native riparian ecobuffer, for example. They work best as a great tool to stabilize soil. So they're stabilizing the banks and the shorelines. They're improving water quality by filtering sedimentation. They're helping in absorption of nutrients. They're that physical separation between oftentimes agricultural operations or anthropogenic uses and that water body. So in the photo here, you can see there's that flowing water there, and the nicely developed riparian forest on either side, providing all of those ecosystem services it needs. So wildlife are often attracted to water. They've got that need for water as well. And so the riparian buffers really provide critical habitat for wildlife in that their presence along these corridors provides shelter, food, abundance of services for wildlife. So another reason to discuss buffers for erosion would be their function as wind and erosion and snow capture. So these linear plantings of trees, and any forested buffer would provide this function as well. They create a microclimate. So they're really protecting land, creating that vegetation, kind of a ramp effect. So they're protecting the soil so it isn't exposed to high wind speeds. And this is especially important for any kind of exposed soil. Any linear planting can provide this function. So eco buffers, alley cropping designs, and really designing your buffers with intention helps you gain the functions that you're looking for. So for example, in the photo on the screen here, you can see a relatively dense buffer is creating a high snowdrift along its leeward side there. So it's capturing the snow very close to the shelter belt. If you're capturing the snow, that can, and forming, those tall snowbanks, they can really slow down the melt time for that snow, helping to release that water over a longer period of time and potentially reducing overland flow of water in this area. Our diagram on the bottom here, you can really see based on the photo the effect that this forested buffer has. So due to wind speed and snow drop, you can see just how far out from the buffer those effects are continuing. Let's see. So oftentimes we're looking to see shrubs to form the beginning of the ramp structure. So those shrubs provide that initial lifting effect. They're really effective snow trappers, and they protect taller trees from the wind as well. So they lift that wind up and over, and they catch and release snow. Evergreens, for example, in the picture here, over here, they're providing more of a last line of defense for wind and snow. So they're an excellent shelter for wildlife during storms. And they're also providing a lot of that physical barrier to wind and snow, and capturing that last bit to make that snowdrift there. So when you're thinking about your shelter belts and eco buffers and potentially designing with the intention of preventing erosion, you want to really look to some of your current site conditions. So looking to prevailing wind, for example, will help you design your structure so that you can take advantage of which, or design with intention and take advantage of which different services you're looking for. So the prevailing winds vary from spring, summer, and fall, winter, depending on your area. And we're looking here at the maps from Alberta Environment again. And these will really show kind of the general trends for wind directions. Of course, on your property, that might be slightly different, and you can keep track over a season, over a year, to see just really what the wind direction is looking like for your area. Typically, when we're designing shelter belts, we are referencing these maps so that we can make sure that we're providing kind of that best service to your property based on the planting that you're looking into. All right, so trees and water management. So let's just discuss for a moment the physical structure of the trees and how they work to control water on the landscape. So trees can act as one of many water management tools. They can help control water below the surface, on the surface, as well as in the air. So the physical structure of trees and shrubs can help mitigate surface runoff water simply by slowing down melts and by providing that physical barrier for water flowing up above ground. They can provide rain interception, slowing the velocity of rainfall coming down as well. So the tree canopies provide that service themselves. Tree roots create macropores and channels in the ground, so they can provide that physical space for water to travel through the soil and infiltrate the groundwater more freely. They're also less turning the ground into a sponge, increasing that soil moisture content and holding capacity. Tree roots also help hold the soil together. So they block and absorb pollutants and excess nutrients from agricultural activity. So we're thinking now back to that riparian buffer and how those trees are blocking any kind of agricultural inputs from flowing directly into that stream there. So the trees are really acting to help as a physical barrier to any kind of human inputs, for example. As well, there's lots of other really great properties we can discuss. Let's see, what else have we got here? We can discuss as well alley cropping or different forested areas and how those specifically will help with water management. For example, we have Bob's inputted a slide here on swales. So let's talk as a case study here on swales and how swales particularly will help in water management on your landscape. So swales are a shallow level trench dug into the ground, and typically they're placed along the contour lines of a property. So in this photo here, I believe this is Cohen Farm, you can see swales developed along the fields here, and they're following the contours of the land. So this is a passive water harvesting tool. Often it's used in permaculture. It helps prevent against soil erosion, and it helps increase water infiltration. So these swales in the photo there, and you can see them as the kind of variation in that cropped field there, they are working to increase water infiltration. They're collecting rainwater and spring runoff, and they're helping to stop and slow down a lot of that moving surface water, hydrating the surrounding soil. So when you are creating a swale, you're removing soil to create a lower area, and you're placing that soil on the downside of the swale. So more or less like a berm. That water from the swale plumes out underneath the berm and into the surrounding soil. So this berm, it often offers a really great location for planting trees. For example, great tree cover there. You've got lots of options for successful tree species, for example, they have that increased water available to them because of the swale. So you'll see those trees not only work to provide services to your landscape in snow capture or reducing wind speed, but also you can plant species that have other characteristics that you may value. So for example, on Cohen Farm, he's incorporated many different fruit species into his swale, so he can harvest berries, as well as all of the other great ecosystem services from his trees. One note, swales shouldn't be planted on slopes that are greater than 15% or in areas that are really well hydrated. So adding that extra hydration to those areas can cause maybe more erosion than it prevents. Let's look at some plant species that would be great for planting on these berms. We've got lots of native species. Always choose plant species that are suited to your local climate. Lots of times choosing species that have higher water tolerances is a good idea. And then strong roots as well. So you want those species that are going to anchor the soil in place. Let's look. So for example, in this photo, perspective wise, this one swale here is a length of 740 meters and is about 4 meters wide and about, let's see here, 1 meter deep. So perspective on what those swales are actually looking like. The species planted on these swales on Cohen Farm, he has lots of Saskatoons, he has currants, many different riparian species that are great in areas where there's higher moisture. So staking and fascines are another great tool for riparian erosion control and slope stabilization. So in this photo, this is a photo of a project from Grande Prairie area. We've got a great team in the Grande Prairie area. Jill and Kate have spent a good deal of time scouting out good sites for erosion mitigation measures. And oftentimes we're looking to bring in staking using live woody material to help prevent erosion. So in this picture, we're looking at collecting willow and dogwood stakes, and we're using those live sticks to plant them in the ground and have their physical structure both prevent erosion and also grow into a new tree to increase their erosive protection. Let's see, so stem cuttings are segments of mature dormant woody stems with the shoot and the intact lateral buds. So stem cuttings of certain species, willow, dogwood, cottonwood, different types of poplar, they'll grow into new trees and shrubs when harvested and stored and planted properly. So although harvesting stem cuttings, it's a bit labor intensive, lots of times with teams of volunteers, it can be a great way to reforest areas and help prevent erosion. So in Alberta, some of the best species are those willow, red osier dogwood, plains cottonwood, balsam poplar. So this just means they root with the highest success rates when they're planted this way. Best time to harvest them is when they're dormant. So that's when you're not seeing green leaves on those plants. And as well, it may seem like you're damaging the vegetation by removing stem cuttings, but these species are very readily recuperate from cuttings like this. So they're a good donor species for riparian projects. We want to take note that we don't let our cuttings dry out. They need to be planted within about 3 days after harvest. And you want to keep their rooting ends soaking in water. So that just keeps them nice and have the best chance at growing after they've been planted. So in the photo here, we're planting our willow and dogwood cuttings, planting about 3/4 into the soil. And you want to plant your cuttings so that the bottom of the cutting is as close to or in the groundwater zone as possible. So you want those lowest nodules to be submersed in water because that's where your roots are going to start to grow. And we're not really going to be concerned about the top part having a lot of above ground mass because we're really looking to set roots first and then grow that top portion later on. All right. So here's an example of the scenes. This is again a project in Grande Prairie area where we're using that physical structure of the willow and dogwood to grow into a living barrier to prevent the erosion there. So in this example, we're looking at an area right along some flowing water where we have seen quite a bit of erosion, and it's very close to some infrastructure within a farmyard. So we're looking to use this live woody material both as a physical barrier, but also as a source of new material to grow into an abundance of new willow and dogwoods. So looking at all of these stakes poking out of the ground, we want to take note that they are half to 3/4 into the soil. So they're providing that deep physical barrier to erosion. And also the part above the soil is going to then grow into a tree or a bush or a willow or a dogwood and provide just that stability to the bank as water moves through this area. To give some context to the picture, you can see just briefly on the top here, we have that infrastructure I was talking about. And then on this far right-hand corner here, we have some Saskatoons that were providing that service to the bank until they did get washed down the bank there. So through this project, we've left the Saskatoons in place because they are providing some structure now. And we've added 2 fascines here and lots of staking. So the staking is about 30 centimeters apart, 30 to 50 centimeters apart. So very close together. Here's another example where we're staking dogwood. Dogwoods is an excellent species for staking as well. It grows very readily this way. And in this photo, you can see the dogwood is almost planted on a vertical slope. So they're sticking straight out of the bank, and not to worry, the plant material as they grow will just kind of grow upwards and provide that stability to the bank, as well as some nice vegetated cover to prevent future erosion. So our final photo here, we have a nice shot of a kind of ephemeral drain here. We've got a willow tree in the foreground, and we have lots of opportunity to revegetate this area with more what do we have? Sandbar willow here, so that we can prevent future erosion of that drain area. So prevent steepening of the banks and deepening of the channel by introducing more vegetation to slow down the flow of the water and to start to capture some of that sediment that might be moving through the channel as well. Let's see, maybe it's a good time right now to stop. Does anybody have any questions? I've moved through quite a bit of material relatively quickly. Let's see, there's a few things in the chat here. No. Okay. Well, I can share. Please just type any questions you have into the chat, and I can I can monitor that briefly, or Jill or Kate can give me a heads up if there's a question in the chat. I'm happy to have any questions. I've been working with this information for a long time now, so I can I can break it down or provide some further examples or go back a slide and talk more about any particular things that folks are interested in. I know we have a lot of the photos and information here is right from Grande Prairie area, and our team with the county and the watershed, Cows and Fish, and the ACA, we have lots of great knowledge on what works well in the area and what we've tried and what we maybe won't try again. So we're happy to share any of that information as well. Let's see, I can continue in my presentation a bit further. Jill or Kate, was there anything that you guys were looking to expand more on that I maybe didn't explain well enough?
I think I'm good, Megan, so far. Thanks.
Okay. All right. So protecting ephemeral drains, I guess, and containing ephemeral drains. So ephemeral drains are those temporary creeks that run through land. They fill up when there's excess water, so in the springtime, in periods of heavy rainfall. And other than that, they're mainly dry. Lots of times you can see these drains in aerial photographs. So here in this photo, you can see the ephemeral drain running through the landscape. A lot of times in those agricultural landscapes, those ephemeral drains don't have any distinguishing features apart from the agricultural lands. They don't have any of that native riparian vegetation retained in those structures, and they don't have any of those trees to slow down the water. So lots of times this is okay, but sometimes when we're experiencing higher periods of flow, so for example, if neighbors are removing wetlands from their property and more water is running through ephemeral drains across the landscape, we can see increased flow and increased erosion in these circumstances. So by planting riparian buffers, we can help slow down these ephemeral creeks, and the roots and the foliage of the plants can help slow that velocity and prevent further erosion when it starts happening. And those plant roots, they can actually help allow that excessive moisture to infiltrate into the soil rather than flowing above, it can flow below. And so that's our goal in any of our restoration projects, is to kind of mitigate that overland flow, both speed and quantity, and work to get that water more below ground and recharging those low areas, those wetland areas, through that below ground flow rather than the disruptive above ground flows. Let's see, here's one of the projects that we worked on with our Grande Prairie area crew. This was a restoration project that we've been working on last season along the Bear River. So this project, our team, and led by Adam, the Mighty Peace Watershed Association, saw the restoration of a floodplain to an area along the Bear River. So this particular project, there was a very deep channel running through agricultural land. So I think, and we'll skip ahead for a moment to our slide here, we can see just how steep these banks were. It was impassable for the agricultural equipment that needed to move through the area, impassable for any cattle that were walking, and impassable for wildlife that were using that forested buffer as a wildlife corridor. We looked to restore a floodplain. So that floodplain really would help hold the water or provide that extra area for the water to slow it down, providing somewhere for that water to go when we're experiencing higher rainfall events or spring runoff events. So looking at the bottom of the floodplain, we're not seeing a lot of vegetation in this photo, and that's simply due to low levels of vegetation because of the agricultural activity, but also the high flow levels had washed any vegetation around the shoreline that was there into the creek and downstream. So part of the mitigation in this project, silt fencing was installed. Banks were lowered by using heavy equipment to help create more of a natural floodplain function to the system. And staking was used as a tool to revegetate the area, hopefully providing that wildlife corridor, providing that function that riparian buffers do by slowing down the soil, helping infiltrate into groundwater, and reducing any inputs from agricultural activity into that water body, into the Bear River, and just overall providing all those functions. Jill, Kate, did you guys have any information or content that you guys wanted to add or wanted me to touch on with respect to the project here? I know Jill and Kate have been involved, so maybe they're in those photos in the bottom there too as well.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. Yeah, no, this was a very extreme example, something that we have never experienced in our county, especially to this extent. With the last few years, we had a very high runoff rate, and then, of course, we're really, very running very high, and this kind of thing doesn't typically happen, but if it does, it's pretty significant. So we were really appreciative of Oz coming in to give some advice and some help on how to potentially restore this part of the property. So obviously it's not farmable anymore. However, the banks where it's been cut off will be used for grazing down the road. So thanks again to Oz for all the work that you guys have put into start the restoration of this project.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Jill. It's a fun project, and I know our team's excited to see what's growing there this spring and how this spring's spring snow runoff has impacted the area further, or if our newly created floodplain is doing its job. Hopefully, we'll see a lot of those willows and dogwood leaf out in springtime, and yeah, we'll see the start to that riparian buffer regrowing again. Let's see. Next we can talk about an example of alley cropping. So alley cropping, also known as intercropping, it's another agroforestry tool. And in this example, we're creating rows of buffers throughout the agricultural production areas. So we're not only using marginal land, but we're using a small amount of productive land. And by creating many different buffers, we're helping to lift that wind right up and over the field itself. So we're providing a very nice microclimate for the agricultural crops, and that can help to boost productivity, increase pollinators, provide lots of different ecosystem services. Another great opportunity this type of planting provides is opportunity for a different crop from the woody material itself. So you can look to plant species where you can perhaps harvest perennial forage crops, for example, woody material for harvest such as firewood or biomass or energy. There's lots of different opportunities there. Saskatoon buckthorn or buffalo berry for berry production. So the amalgamation of ecosystem services into alley crops can provide lots of great benefits to the landscape and potentially benefits to your agricultural production as well. So like I said, with the increase in pollinators, choosing tree species, for example, that would fix nitrogen can also help increase production in nearby crops, as well as adding like evapotranspiration, so increasing the microclimate as well. And a lot of the times we'll make sure that we're planting trees on for example, a north-south axis to take advantage of sunlight hours reduction of wind speeds, take advantage of all of the factors that we can to increase our agricultural production as well. Let's see. All right, so with respect to erosion, we're really looking to plants to lock down the soil. So locking down the soil, there's lots of ways to do that. I mean, you can first look to plant species that sucker and form many more of themselves. So by propagating, they're increasing their ability to lock down the soil. By incorporating a mix of deep and shallow root systems, we're helping provide a greater ability to lock down the soil as well. So planting species that have higher growth rates, able to sucker really quickly to cover an area and cover off all of the different exposed soil, for example, has lots of great functions for keeping soil in place and allowing water to infiltrate as well. Having a dense foliage cover above ground, it helps provide that friction and resistance to surface flow. And then that canopy of trees again provides just that barrier to slow down rainfall coming to the area. So using suckering species, for example, balsam, aspen, Manitoba maple, and suckering shrubs. There's lots of great suckering shrubs to choose from. Sandbar willow, for example, is a great one to stabilize soil. And then you can also incorporate different herbaceous and grass species to help cover the soil and provide a lot of those same functions and habitat. So looking at for species examples, little blue stem grass is a great one, June grass as well. Purple prairie clover, for example, also stabilizes soil and fixes nitrogen as well. Yarrow is a great one. It's also a pollinator, so both stabilizing the soil and offering pollinator habitat as well. Let's see. Do we have any other species that folks would like to talk about? Any recommendations for species selection? Any question on species and how well they would do in stabilizing the soil?
Yeah, we'll definitely be discussing some good candidates for the Grande Prairie area coming up here as well. Yeah, I can switch off here, Megan, if that works.
Yep, that works. I can have a drink of water.
All right, I'll get my screen loaded here. Okay, so yeah, Megan was previously talking about alley cropping and how you can kind of bring those benefits to erosion control right in the middle of production fields. And then, yeah, kind of going on about riparian species and how, selecting the right species can really have a big impact on the overall effectiveness of kind of your erosion control techniques. Here's another thing to consider when it comes to erosion in agricultural settings is also focusing on, the upland drier conditions and what species are best suited to provide that erosion control, whether it's on drier slopes that aren't necessarily by riparian areas, or if you're primarily looking to reduce wind erosion of topsoil. So you want to look for the species that can tolerate drought or can tolerate a range of different soil moisture conditions, or are relatively adaptable to those changing conditions. Generally, anything with any species that have an extensive root system, a deep binding root system for locking down that soil, as well as having that depth to reach any water that's deeper down in the soil in drier areas. And then when you have areas of high wind, you want those species that have those deep root systems that offer the best in terms of being able to keep upright in heavier wind events. I know some Culprits that tend not to do well in higher wind events would be like black spruce up in the north. They tend to have shallower roots and can be easily knocked over compared to their other cousin, white spruce, which tends to have a bit better of a binding root system. So if you're looking at drier conditions, but still want to get that soil stabilization, wolf willow is a really good plant to consider. It's relatively drought tolerant, and it's a shrub that's basically known for its silvery green foliage, and usually can be found throughout Alberta, and basically has kind of a couple different superpowers. It's tolerant of alkaline soils, so if you have any sort of poor areas that you're finding the areas hard to grow, wolf willow can take advantage of that, as well as it being a nitrogen fixer. It can add nutrients back into a relatively poor soil site, on top of producing dense thickets from suckering. Snowberry is another one that's adaptable to a range of conditions. I'll talk more about that one. Same with prickly rose. And for taller trees, for pioneer trees, so in Alberta we kind of have three big ones, so birch, balsam, poplar, and aspen. Your best bet for kind of drier upland conditions would be the trembling aspen. It's tolerant, again, of a range of soil moisture regimes, and can be tolerant of drier conditions. And on top of it, having the ability to sucker, so it can form pretty dense thickets and regenerate over time. So adding that into any sort of shelter built or eco buffer, or even the upper areas of a riparian buffer, definitely adds that resiliency to drier conditions, on top of having that regeneration cycle through those suckers. So for a taller tree, for drier conditions, if it's deciduous, trembling aspen is quite good, as well as if you're looking for conifers. Drier conditions with perhaps sandier soils, lodgepole pine is a really good one. So in the Grande Prairie area, they tend to be on the west side of Alberta range, and then as we move further east, we get the jack pine. But for Grande Prairie, lodgepole pine and the aspen would be two good taller trees. And itself being a conifer, the lodgepole pine is actually still considered a pioneer tree, just because it tends to grow quite fast and is usually one of the first ones in its range to populate an area. And so there's a few different plants that do quite well as far as if you're looking at slope stabilization, especially in the northern portion of Alberta around Grande Prairie. So red osier dogwood is an excellent choice for riparian areas or slopes in general, mainly because it is, again, adaptable to a range of different moisture conditions. So it'll take definitely it will take advantage of soil that has higher moisture content, but it can still be found upland in drier areas. As far as slope stabilization, it's one of the better native species out there. It has a really deep binding root system. It's great for slope control. It does well in higher winds. It forms impressive thickets, and as Megan said earlier, it's a really good candidate for stem cutting and doing live stakes of it, because it will root from those stakes. In fact, with the red osier dogwood bushes, if one of those branches actually makes contact with the soil, it will actually sometimes root again. So interesting there. And it's also an excellent source for pollinators, birds, and mammals. A lot of mammals, such as deer, really enjoy browsing it. It has a nickname of deer candy, so it's one of their favorite shrubs to browse, and it recovers quite well from heavy browse too. So it's another great one to add into any sort of planting, due to its unique ability to regenerate quite a bit faster. And then another term it's been called too is ice cream of the forest, for again, for its likeness from deers. And then fast growth. It's in a lot of our plantings, we find it's one of the ones that, you know, seems to within 1 or 2 seasons proliferate quite a bit. And then, yeah, another one that Megan mentioned before, Sandbar Willow, another great for stabilizing slopes. This one, again, it can be staked from live cuttings. And the thing about this one is it does prefer soils with higher moisture content. So it's really at home on those riparian buffers or any sort of lowland areas in, you know, crop production or pasture land where the moisture will find its way to collect. So really good one to plant around those ephemeral drains or those ephemeral creeks. Again, has that spreading root system to help stabilize thicket forming, very fast growth. So if you're to plant something and you want to see, you know, success right away, plant some Sandbar Willow, because that'll be one of the first ones that potentially will grow taller than you within 1 or 2 years. On top of that, it's one of the best pollinator sources for native species we have. It has an early bloom period and a really long blooming period. So a great resource for our native pollinators. Another really common one that is found throughout the province is prickly rose. This little guy, they're very hardy and they're drought tolerant as well. Oftentimes they'll take advantage of any sort of open site that some other species may not like because they're being a bit pickier. On top of that, for pollinators, they're a really good source, and the rose hips that they produce later in the year are a good resource for birds, as well as those rose hips often stay on the bush over winter, becoming another excellent food source when food becomes scarcer. Yeah, another good choice to use in erosion prone areas that you're trying to fix if you have livestock in the area, because again, with the thorns, it usually helps deter browsing in that area or browsing of these plants themselves. So that's one benefit there. And then we have snowberry and western snowberry. So these plants really good at forming those low-lying thickets. Again, very tolerant of those poor soil areas. So if you're having trouble facilitating something there, try some snowberry. These guys, again, you can take cuttings of. They can be tolerant of alkaline soils. They also offer late season blooming for pollinators. And again, they're one of the species that usually retain their berries over the winter. Again, being a good food source for birds. Another species that has really good fast growth and is often actually found along slopes because that's a soil stabilizing root system that they have. So here's kind of two good pictures kind of showcasing. So on the left, we have kind of a dense thicket of native rose, and you can see the red rose hips on them already kind of forming. So that's a really good example of kind of in a natural area how those rose bushes form those dense thickets, and you can kind of imagine underground there's a really extensive root system taking place, locking down that soil, preventing any sort of erosion, whether it's from, you can kind of see there's a slight slope there from surface runoff or, you know, high water events. And then on the right, we have snowberry. Again, this is a picture that was taken later in the fall, and you can already see how those berries are still there, and there's lots of them. So again, a really excellent source, and you can see how they kind of form a thicket, growing pretty fast. So really good to have in those eco buffer or riparian buffer plantings, especially if you're looking to cover a large area, because of those spreading features. They'll take quickly to the area, and you'll have a good establishment. Yeah, and then again, as Megan kind of mentioned earlier, when you get, you know, that ground cover area, tend not to want to forget about that, especially if you're doing any sort of planting where there's either a lack of ground cover or you're establishing a brand new planting. It's good to focus on adding in ground covers for, to fill those gaps in between plantings, especially as those smaller trees have to grow up. And then those herbaceous plants like grasses and wildflowers, they can often have just as extensive root systems, just a little more delicate. And that can help lock down the soil. And then yarrow is one of a really great native wildflower that we have. Again, you can find it throughout the province. And basically it propagates through rhizomes or seeding. So it'll spread out with its root network and provide really good slope stabilization if you were to seed it along a slope. And another really hardy and adaptable flower that really doesn't mind going into those areas that less tolerant species will avoid. So those hard to establish areas, it can be a really good ground cover on top of some other native grasses and wildflowers. So just to kind of wrap up here, as far as like what would be best suited for an erosion problem area. So if you're upland or you're focusing on, protecting fields from or buildings or other features from wind erosion, bit drier conditions. As far as planting stock, best to focus on, planting plugs or bare root stock of those, 1 or 2 year seedlings, or if you have, larger trees to plant. Whereas when you get into areas where, possibly lower lying areas where water's collecting, those are riparian areas on either sides of water bodies, lakes, creeks, rivers, and as well as those slopes up from them. You can get away with planting those stakes or fascines because they do really well with that extra moisture in the ground to basically stimulate that rooting feature that they have. And then you can also incorporate those plugs or bare root stock of those species that tend not to take very well from staking. And then you can also incorporate them on the upland area for some of those larger trees, especially with the conifers such as tamarack and spruce. So yeah, kind of food for thought for if you're tackling the kind of 2 different areas of popular erosion problems. And then yeah, last but not least, just a little plug here for Oz. For a lot of planting projects, we can basically help out from site consultation. So we can go out for a site assessment and kind of get the lay of the land and conditions, as well as, coming up with a planting design, working with you as a landowner, and then, help with funding, stock ordering, and the actual planting of the project. So if you ever have any questions, feel free to reach out to us, and we're always happy to help with any questions, as well as if you have any, project inspirations or project ideas that you'd like to, get started off the ground and need a little help as far as direction, or wanting to involve Oz, or if you're in Grande Prairie, contacting the county and asking Jill and Kate some questions too. They're quite helpful. But yeah, so that's kind of the end of our presentation, and now we have some time for any sort of discussion, questions. Feel free to unmute yourself and you can ask away, or if there's any questions in the chat, we can get to those as well.
We usually try and incorporate quizzes or polls into our presentations, and I think I was too late in talking with Jill and Kate to add those to this presentation. So I'll ask you a poll. Just type into the chat yes or no. It won't be anonymous this way, but so true or false. Willow water is as effective as a rooting hormone for use for propagating trees. So true or false. Willow water, or water with willow soaking in it, is as effective as a rooting hormone powder for propagating trees and shrubs. All right, I can just give the answer. So willows have that hormone that's in rooting hormone is actually made from willow bark. So willows are willows are those species that are such great propagators that the hormones in their bark are what rooting hormone is made of. So by soaking other species, you can increase their ability to root out when you're trying to propagate them. So taking a cutting of a currant or another species that does have a tendency to propagate that way, and you can really increase its likelihood of growing roots as a cutting by soaking it in willow water. You can also make your own willow water to use at home. It's fairly easy. You just take a bunch of willow cuttings and soak them in some water and add whatever species you're interested in propagating and see what happens. One thing to note when propagating trees this way is to be gentle when you're planting them, because those roots are fairly vulnerable. And so don't just stuff them in the ground. Make sure you're gentle and shovel them a hole and pack them in kindly.
Yeah, no, it's I always like that, how that's, a possibility to get that magical rooting hormone from the willows. And
Yeah, I'm going to ask a question on behalf of, I know we get a lot of similar comments, but is there a best time of year to harvest willows if you're planning on putting them in as cuttings? So maybe just kind of go over some of the best practices for that.
Sure. Let me see. I've brought up, OZA has a riparian manual. Riparian manual. It's available on our website. I'm just going to share my screen here with the riparian manual in there. Let me just move some things out of the way. There we go. And in this manual, let me see, near the bottom, it'll load. We have lots of information in here on how to stake and how to plant. I think it's right near the bottom here. Stem cuttings. So we're looking at near the end of the manual, page 42. So we're looking at taking stem cuttings here. We have a photo of somebody kind of sticking their stem cutting into the bank of a moving waterway. But this manual will outline different practices for taking stem cuttings, planting stem cuttings. Essentially, you want to, we must be on the planting chapter. What we want to do is harvest our stem cuttings when there aren't any leaves on them, so that when they're dormant. This will cause the least stress to our cuttings and make sure that they're planting the stem cuttings in the early spring or kind of the late fall when the seedlings are dormant. So they have that full winter or ideal growing conditions to start growing. So if you're planting them in the fall, they're dormant all winter and they can start growing when there's increased moisture in the spring. And if you're planting in the spring, make sure you're planting when they're cutting and planting when they're dormant. And then planting them early enough that they can still take advantage of those really moist spring conditions. This manual as well, it has some great information in it. Oh, I must have slow internet tonight. It has some great information in it for all of the different aspects of restoring riparian buffers. And let me see here. There's a chapter as well on taking stem cuttings. So page 25, selecting stem cuttings for harvest here. Bob, did you have any information to share on stem cuttings?
Yeah, no, I think you definitely covered, just basically ensuring that you're doing the harvesting during those dormancy periods, which in Alberta is usually April, kind of end of April for spring, and then October for the fall. And then ideally, if you can, to harvest and stake relatively close together, and not store them too long. That way you'll have the best success when staking them for propagation. But I see that, Jennifer has her hand raised if you have a question.
I do. Actually, we did some Northwest poplar cuttings. We took them at the beginning of March, and now they've got the little bud coming and I'm getting some small roots. Awesome. But I am scared to plant. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with it, but I'm concerned about planting them because those little roots are very delicate And
Mhm.
you said we should plant them kind of early spring. Is that okay? Or should we kind of hang on to them for a while and let them root in some potting soil?
Either
Yeah.
either way, you'll likely have success with your planting. Being gentle on the roots during planting, especially for bare roots, and a lot of the times when they're brand new, fresh roots that have just grown, they're quite delicate. So you want to be gentle and not make sure those roots don't brush off when you're putting them in the soil. But yeah, it's definitely up to your preference there. Bob, you've got information to share.
Oh yeah, no, I was good. Yeah, you could definitely stake them in the ground now. What I would do, yeah, just to protect the roots, because a lot of the early species are starting to bud out here and wake up. You can just make a pilot hole with something that is larger in diameter than the actual stake. Then that way you can kind of be gentle when putting it in rather than pushing it in, grinding the roots against the soil. And just to make sure that the ground is in fact thawed where you are. It should be probably by now.
Oh yeah, no, it's frozen still.
It's still frozen. Okay.
Yeah. Usually we plant in the middle of May. Would that be too long to wait?
No, yeah, I kind of forgot that we're up in Grande Prairie. I was,
Yeah.
but yeah. So if you're May is still fine for planting for sure.
Okay, so right now, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, you really just want to make sure that you are taking advantage of the spring moisture. So planting in August or July when it's very hot and dry isn't a great idea. But yeah, May is perfect.
Yeah, because if I hang on to them till like September, that's too long to wait.
Well, they'll definitely spoil by then.
Yeah, unless they'll probably make a saying they'll probably wilt by then, unless you put them in potting soil stock in pots or something. If you want to keep them that way, and they'll still grow, and then you'll have probably some monster poplars by the time you plant them in the fall. So.
Well, because right now they're in about 4-inch deep little pots.
Okay. Yeah, so you just want to make sure if you do end up keeping them over the summer, just to increase the pot size so they have some room to grow their roots out. But yeah, I would say if you wait till the ground thaws, and if May is looking good, then yeah, just make sure you got a big enough hole that it's not putting any pressure on the roots, and then tamp it down pretty good, and they should have no problem.
Well, geez, it's really, so we probably have to water them an awful lot too to keep them alive.
Yeah, just make sure it's moist.
Yeah. Okay.
Another factor to consider might be for looking at your site and looking at the vegetation competition that you have. So you do want to make sure that you don't have more than 50% cover, like grass cover over top of your seedlings, so that they are getting some light infiltrating through to where they are, so that they can do well. If you're looking at tall grass where you're going to be planting your cuttings, you may want to wait until they're a little bit taller and they can kind of reach up and out of the grass cover that's there as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I just have one other question that we get quite a bit. What are some ways of preserving that soil moisture, particularly, if we get a really hot, dry summer like we did last year? Are there any tips that you could let people know about when you're planting your seedlings or your stakes to preserve that soil moisture?
Yeah, so I would suggest, if you already know you're planting into an area that's prone from drying out and has those drier conditions, to really select those species that are drought tolerant in the first place, and then once they'll be able to withstand those drier conditions and even have normal growth, and then when there is moisture available, they'll really benefit from that. So that's I always suggest starting out with a species, generally with whichever kind of whether you're looking at small shrubs, high shrubs, pioneer trees, conifer trees. There's usually something that can fit the moisture conditions that you're experiencing. And then, so starting out with those species is what I would suggest, because it's, yeah, if it's a new site, it's always hard to maintain moisture if there's no, protection from shade or anything like that. So it's, yeah, it can be tough. Besides, if you have any sort of irrigation set up, that would be quite nice, but oftentimes that's not the case. But yeah, my biggest recommendation would just be to, yeah, start with those species that can withstand, those average to below average moisture conditions.
We like to share some of our resources on our website. Oz has a native species database on our website, right at the top in that orange button there. And in this this database, you can search for trees that will be particularly suited to your conditions here. So in our search bar, you can pick the region that you're in, boreal region, for example, and then you can pick some of the specific site conditions that you're looking for, or tree services also you can pick in there. So this is for wet conditions. And you can see lots of different species come up on there. Let me see, where is Bob's favorite dogwoods? Are they coming up here? Yeah, it's them.
I know there's some sandbar down there, but
no, and then you can look at your site condition or the conditions for their particular tree there, and it will give you its traits and how much wet, moist, poor or moderate drainage. So you can look to see all the different particulars these trees do best in. Another point to recommend for making sure you have adequate water for your seedlings here would be to look to providing mulch. So mulching around seedlings can provide reduced vegetation competition, so it can keep weeds back, but it can also create a better microclimate for your seedlings as well by helping to retain moisture and protect the ground from that hot sun in the summertime as well as cold in the winter. So it really helps moderate soil conditions. There's lots of different types of mulch that are available depending on what you have available to you or your different site conditions. For so for like very flat agricultural type sites, a lot of times folks are using plastic mulch or even biodegradable plastic mulches. You can see that's the black mulch there. Here we have a different option, would be a pulp mat or a hemp mat. And you can place them around the trees. They help to keep the vegetation down, so grass or weeds. They can also help increase moisture retention right around the seedlings. I think in our next photo here, we have organic mulches. That works as well. And depending on just what you have available and your budget, your resources, time, you can look to increase kind of that moisture holding capacity of the soil and the surrounding material itself to reduce need for watering in the long term.
Could I ask a question about that?
For sure.
We went and we put probably about 4 inches of mulch around our northwest poplar that we planted a few years ago. And after we did that, we were warned that it can cause like mold and sicknesses in the trees. Have you ever seen that, especially in high moisture years?
Oh, you want to make sure here in the bottom photo here, you want to make sure that you're using that donut shape. So the mulch you guys were using that donut shape. You didn't have the mulch touching the trunk of the tree.
No. Well, we did originally, then we pulled it away after we heard that.
Okay. We haven't seen any problems using mulch, and mulch it's something that's very common in natural systems themselves, having organic material breaking down around the trees. So looking at, for example, a natural forest versus a traditional shelter where we're rototilling around the trees to maintain that limited vegetation cover, the natural forest system with mulch would be the healthier environment for the soil as well as for the trees.
What was it? Wood chips or like straw that you were using?
It was spruce wood chips from like an old mill.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. unless, yeah, and I'm not sure if it was a higher moisture year or something like that, or if there was already potentially, with mulch, it can be already contaminated with a higher population of spores. So that can sometimes be the case, but yeah, like Megan was saying, even with the loose mulch, the drainage tends to be a bit better than even some of the mulch mats or the plastic mulch, which we typically don't find too many cases of.
Okay.
But yeah, sorry to hear, but hopefully it bounced back.
Oh, no, we didn't. I just read that could happen. No, so far
Okay.
so good. So I made sure that hole was kind of farther away from the trunk.
Oh, okay. Oh, perfect. Okay, yeah, that's good then. Yeah, but yeah, it should, like Megan was saying, should be good. If anything, it's always better to have a little too much moisture. Sometimes.
For that.
Do we have any other questions or any other areas that you guys wanted more information on? Any other common questions that you got, Jill, Kate, that you guys receive?
Sometimes we get questions about where to order seedlings. Not everyone has the ability or the, physical aptitude to be out trimming willows or doing estates, because it is very labor intensive. Is there anywhere that you could recommend that people could potentially order seedlings or stakes from? I know in the past there was the shelter belt program through PFRA. We would have them shipped up from Saskatchewan. However, that program is no longer happening, so we do get a lot of questions regarding that. Anybody that wants to look at further information, we do have a county website. And perhaps, Kate, you can share that. We do have lots of resources available there. But just wondering if you have any good recommendations for places to order seedlings.
Typically, Oz does bulk seedling orders in the spring and in the fall. We do need some time to kind of get our custom grow orders organized. So right about now we're submitting orders for 2023, and we would be able to we can combine multiple landowners right within our order, and then see that the seedlings make it to Grande Prairie area in time for spring planting. So working with your counties is a lot of times the best opportunity to get seedlings. And in Grande Prairie, you can work directly with Oz, and we work with Grande Prairie to kind of get some seedlings there. Otherwise, looking to nurseries that are most local to you. So nurseries in your area or in the Boreal region, for example, would have the best species selection suited to your landscape. So for example, if we've got stakeholders in southern Alberta who are looking for seedlings, we tell them to look at nurseries in their area. They have the best abundance suited for them. The same goes for folks in northern Alberta. So looking to nurseries and suppliers local is your best opportunity for seedlings that will kind of do best in the environmental conditions. Lots of times there's kind of a variety of stakes and plugs available from nurseries. So we can also talk with people directly and help them based on the selection of seedlings that they have. If folks are interested, they can contact us through our website, or our phone numbers are on there as well.
Yeah, perfect. I was just going to mention too, the county does have a tree seedling planter. If you are interested in renting it, it's available for rent. You can check it out on our website. I'm just trying to find our website here. Turn the screen share. We've got too many screens on the go here. But the County of Grande Prairie definitely does have some good information on there under the agriculture tab.
I can toss Oz's website, the link into this riparian buffer manual. And this one's a great opportunity for information on restoring vegetation to riparian areas, as well as lots of great information on restoring buffers, eco buffers, any kind of seedling planting as well. For the native species database, I can toss this one in the link here too.
Yeah, and then I guess, yeah, Jill has up here that helpful tree planter that you can rent from the County of Grande Prairie. So those machines can make quick work if you have some large linear plantings. Essentially, you can drop the seedling, and then it tucks it in nicely into the soil, and you can do a lot of seedlings with less back breaking work. But if you were to do it, the classic tree planter way with bags and shovels.
Yeah, Bob's experience, both past and future experience. We typically as well have some planters available in the spring and in the fall to help out with projects depending on the volume of trees you're planting, and can be in the Grande Prairie area to help get some ground as needed.
Yeah, and then Jill has here the plastic mulch roller applicator, which again, you need that if you're kind of going after the biodegradable plastic mulch application to help you lay it out. Basically, you just hook up the roll, and then it rolls it out and then tucks it in with the soil, so you can have those nice lines, and then afterwards you go in and plant your trees either by a shovel or again with that tree applicator. Always recommend laying down the mulch first and then going into to plant the trees, and you just go straight through the mulch. If you do it the other way around, it can be quite tricky to find those seedlings once they're covered up in the mulch, if you have to cut a hole and bring them up. So yeah, definitely if you're gonna put plastic or biodegradable plastic mulch down first and then plant into it, whereas if you were to do the hemp mats, those already have a slit around each mat, so you can just plant first and then come back and plop one of those mats around each seedling. And they work really great for plantings that aren't level or non-linear, and so those plastic mulch applicators don't really work well for those situations, especially if you're on slopes. So yeah, the hemp mats are really good for that, or you could just use the loose organic mulch, whether it's wood chips or straw. That's an effective, relatively inexpensive option, especially if you have your own source for that. But nice thing about the other mulches, like the biodegradable plastic mulch and the hemp mats, they will biodegrade eventually, but they last quite a bit longer than those loose organic mulches, which you often would have to reapply every season or two as they either biodegrade or just get scattered by various sources.
Another thing to mention when using the mulch or the biodegradable mulch is we recommend using a planting shovel. You can see the planting shovel there on the left. It has quite a bit narrower of a shovel. The shovel itself is quite narrow as opposed to a regular garden spade. When you're using that mulch, you want to make that hole around the seedling as small as possible to reduce potential weeds that can come right through the hole. I know in a lot of the agricultural plantings that Oz does, and especially because we need to have such rototilled soil for using those mulch rollers, we want to make sure that we're reducing possibility of weeds as much as possible, because that seed bank is there and those weeds can really make an impact to how well your seedlings are growing. So making sure to use the right shovel, reduce that opening in the mulch as much as possible, and then making sure you're maintaining a reduced vegetation competition by weeds is always recommended.
Yeah, and then as well, if you check the county webpage of Grande Prairie, I believe, we will have some other courses or workshops later in the month. I think one as soon as next week. And then those ones will go a little more in depth about how, eco buffers and shelter belts, all the services you can get out of them, as well as how to, effectively design and establish those plantings. Whereas today was kind of a heavier focus on really focusing on erosion control. And so, yeah, feel free to tune into those ones and you'll get hopefully a little more of an education on eco buffers.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Just to follow up with that, I will be sending out an email after this just with some links to Oz website as well as links to the county's website with the rental equipment page. And then there I will be posting the link to register for next week's webinar if you haven't already done so. And it is next Thursday on the 21st at 7 p.m.
Perfect.
All right. Thank you, Kate.
Can I ask
yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, because I logged in late, so I don't know if you've covered. We planted a bunch of Northwest poplars on the outside of our shelter belt, and they did great for 3 years. And now our outside row, the deer are coming and they're picking off the new growth, including the bottoms. So they're kind of looking more shrubby rather than a tree. So short of a fence or do you have any ideas to get them away, to keep them away?
It's interesting that they're browsing heavily enough, to go after the suckers and everything.
Oh yeah.
So deer depth perception isn't great. So dimensional fencing can help. I know that's an expensive option, but thinking about adding depth to what any deer deterrent. So having two rows of deterrent potentially, if you're using like a temporary fencing, for example, might be a way to keep the deer away.
Yeah, I know another option would just be to, this is assuming you have the room for it, but you can add another row or just patches of other species that like I mentioned earlier with the red osier dogwood, that they would prefer first, as well as it being a plant that recovers quite well from heavy browse, and so if they focus more on those and kind of get their fill, that would take some of the pressure off of the aspen trees. So yeah, that is one possibility, is kind of planting things to other plants to distract them. But yeah, the problem with the larger mammal browsing is short of fencing, it's really hard, especially with larger areas, to keep them out. And once they kind of know it's there, they kind of like to return. One thing we had in a previous workshop, somebody brought up is you can plant salt licks in different areas away from your trees, and that can kind of send them into a different area based on the preference of going to that source of salt. So
yeah, the salt licks are probably a pretty good idea. One of the best methods that I've seen, and quite like a low cost and a low, not very invasive to your property as well. So they just kind of encourage the deer to take a different route through your property. Of course, if there really isn't a lot of food around for the deer, it's not going to prevent them from kind of heading back over to the poplars.
How far from the poplars should that salt lick be?
As far as possible, ideally just on the other side. And always keep in mind the deer will take the path of least resistance. So encouraging them to an easy route that doesn't go near the poplars would be
Okay.
kind of a recommendation.
Thank you.
Another great source of information and examples of erosion mitigation projects. I know the Mighty Peace Watershed website has some examples of projects that are ongoing right now. A couple of the examples that we spoke about tonight are included in their website. So I'll just paste that in the chat for folks to reference here.
But yeah, if anybody else has any sort of last minute questions, feel free to. We're here to hopefully help answer. But yeah, short of any more pesky deer, which are always a problem.
That's a tricky one, and we get that question often. So
yeah, the province of Alberta has a pest diagnostic tool that is quite good for a lot of different pests for looking up symptoms and what to do about it. And unfortunately, I know, we checked it quite recently. They didn't have much for what to do with deer because it's a hard problem to.
We got a big dog to help us, but he keeps the neighbors up at night, so got to keep them in the garage.
Oh yeah. I was gonna. You can dogs, coyotes. Deterrents for sure.
Yeah, maybe in a couple of years he'll calm down and be more of a deer deterrent than a neighbor deterrent.
Yeah, right. I hope so. Let's see. Any other resources that you could recommend, Bob?
As far as erosion, I think God, maybe I can post that pest diagnostic tool up here.
Oh, that's a good one. The pest diagnostic tool is really good. I've got a stem cuttings for repairing restoration fact sheet I can post as well. This one should have all of the information for selecting stem cuttings right in there. And it's available on our website as well if anyone's looking for it, just under the fact sheet section. So kind of a lot of that information on timing and harvesting and staking as well. So a good resource for folks. Just kind of that singular topic.
Take myself off mute. Again, we'll go in next week, like Kate mentioned on Thursday. We'll definitely be going a little more in depth as far as answering some of those questions that popped up today. We can cover some of those in the next week's presentation, all about creating those planting projects, and it'll help cover some of those questions a little bit better.
All right. Well, if everyone else, if that's all the questions that we've got, I guess we can sign off for tonight and hopefully catch up with you guys next week and design some projects.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Megan and Bob, for speaking tonight. That was lots of really good information, and I'm looking forward to next Thursday's webinar as well. And thank you everyone who joined us tonight. I hope everyone has a great evening. And again, I'll be following up with this information, hopefully within the next couple of days.
So thank you, Kate. Thank you, Jill.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah.
Okay, thanks guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Have a good night.
Night.